Hello everyone, Sandra here, and today I want to start a multi-part retrospective series on Dark Souls 2. I've been playing a lot of Dark Souls 1 lately, and that's been getting me thinking about the sequels and all of that sort of reception as I've been kind of mulling over the series as a whole. And so I want to start with kind of the most obvious part of Dark Souls 2, which is the name. So From Software has had a history at this point of making a lot of sort of original titles, at least in the prominence of the modern era, starting with Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1, Bloodborne, and Sekiro, are all being sort of their own IPs. But Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, I'm going to focus on Dark Souls 2 here, but they started this sort of set of sequels, and it's an interesting thing to kind of examine, like, what is the benefit of being a sequel? What's the benefit of being named Dark Souls 2? Now, there's a clear benefit, which is in marketing, right? Dark Souls 1 is really what put FromSoft's name on the map. Demon's Souls started it, yes, but it's Dark Souls 1 that really did it. So the Dark Souls name, it has a lot of value from that sort of marketing standpoint, especially when people weren't hardcore FromSoft fans yet. When people didn't know about From Software or had just kind of heard about Dark Souls 1 and how popular it was, that sort of time, because remember, they hadn't come out with Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, and Sekiro yet. So that time, that name, being named Dark Souls 2, was incredibly powerful. You could potentially have said a new game by the studio who made Dark Souls 1, or who made Dark Souls, but, you know, I think especially at the time, having that name was a really valuable thing for marketing. However, there's a lot of baggage that comes with being named Dark Souls 2. And this is predominantly from expectations, right? People have a lot of expectations that come with sequels, and that's a lot stronger than unconnected games. Like, at this point, FromSoft has developed a specific style, something that we expect from them with any game that they make. We expect a degree of challenge or difficulty, with the purpose of rewarding the player by overcoming that challenge by the natural sort of hormonal release and other sort of brain chemistry stuff that makes us feel accomplished about achieving a difficult task. And that's what the challenge is there to do. So we expect that from a FromSoft game. We also expect solid gameplay, and particularly the combat is generally quite stellar. They've put a lot of time in making sure the combat systems all work well. And then we're also, for FromSoft, we've come to expect some sort of intricate lore that's been created through some careful world building. These are all things that we expect from a FromSoft game in a general sense at this point. But being named Dark Souls 2, that has a higher degree of expectation, especially since we didn't see sort of the road that the sequels would take with Dark Souls 3. Or to Dark Souls 3, I should say. So Dark Souls 2, when people hear that, they expected certain things, particularly back before it came out. So I have a list of some things I think people are kind of anticipating, right? People will anticipate the world building and lore to be kind of the same. So, like, sequels, I should just clarify, sequels are expected to be more of mostly the same. So if I pick up something that says it's a sequel to such and such game, I'm expecting to have such and such a game plus some new stuff, but I'm expecting that same core experience for the most part. So if we look at the Assassin's Creed games as an excellent example of a series that has had a tremendous number of sequels, that core gameplay of, like, how stealthing is there, and the parkour, and all of that sort of stuff, and the synchronization framework, and all of that sort of thing, that was something that was consistent through the games. That's something you came there to expect. So in general, we expect some form of consistency between sequels that's greater, perhaps, than we would unconnected IPs, even by the same studio. So the world building and lore is something that we expected to basically be carryovers or to continue from what happened in Dark Souls 1 somehow. The game didn't really leave itself open to sequels, per se, but you could potentially try to stretch something. But, you know, that's kind of what people were anticipating. So things like locations, names of stuff, all that sort of stuff, NPCs and different characters, we expect that sort of continuity. And then combat is something that we expect to be very similar. Like, in general, people do want their skills to be able to transfer, right? So while we're happy to learn new tricks, we really want it to be something where we can take the skills that we've picked up and to be able to transfer them to the new game, at least to some large extent. And then, like, this is something where it's really important to point out, like, there is this very fine line between being familiar and innovative, and you need to be familiar enough to actually feel like you're a sequel to the thing that you say that you're a sequel to, but you also need to innovate enough that you don't feel like you're just a complete retread, and it's a very difficult thing to hit. And combat's an area where being familiar is something that you're going to be aiming a little bit more towards, right? You're going to be... the locations and stuff is where you're probably going to be pushing more towards new. And then we also expected an overall similar structure to the game. So what I mean by this is things like we expected the story would be told in a similar sort of way, that an enemy arrangement would be fairly similar. So what I mean by that is we expect, ambushes and this sort of thing, like the philosophy of how enemies were placed to be something that would continue. And then a lot of people, and I probably was one of them, anticipated that the level and world design would work in the same sort of way. So, how Dark Souls 1 has that very interconnected world where the map turns back in on itself in a lot of different points, at least for that first core section of the world, right? The Undead Burg, Firelink Shrine, down to Blight Town and through the Poison Swamp, and back up into the Valley of the Drakes and into the forest. Like, all of these areas loop in and connect into each other in a lot of interesting and intricate ways. And this is something that, like, people were anticipating to continue in Dark Souls 2, as well the sort of the intricate detail of how the world was laid out. So this is kind of a set of expectations. And for a lot of them, Dark Souls 2 just generally failed, right? It failed to deliver on this baggage. It failed to deliver on these expectations. So the obvious one that's perhaps most poignant for a lot of people is the world structure stuff that I was just talking about, right? Where the logical layout of the world wasn't really there. The interconnectivity was not really there. The game is very spokes coming out of a wheel sort of thing. We have Majula as a hub, and then things poking off, but things didn't interconnect. And if you look at a map, like, areas logically speaking overlap. You have the whole elevator from Earthen Peak to the Iron Keep, I think it was called, but basically the caldera of a volcano. Like, there's a lot of abstract stuff happening there, so it did not carry forth that philosophy. Now, changing stuff is fine when you change IPs and you don't have those same sort of expectations. Like, Demon's Souls has a very different sort of paradigm. It's got that sort of hub style where you have the Nexus at the center, and then you have the different worlds that you go to, and it's very linear progression out, right? That sort of design is fine when people don't have the expectation of something different. That design works, but people were expecting that same sort of cohesion that Dark Souls 1 had, and that created a lot of problems. And then the combat felt different in a lot of different ways. And I have actually like 5 things I've listed here. So the character movement in general just kind of felt different, and the agility stat really made rolling feel way worse. This was especially bad for Dark Souls 1 hardcore players, because, like, those of us who played a lot of that game, you really learned to dodge. Like, dodging over blocking was your stronger defensive option, so you learned that you needed to be lightweight, that less than 25% max equip load, and you'd have that instinct to respond to danger by rolling. And one of the things that happened is the agility stat reduced iframes, or it influenced iframes, I should say. And so when you first started out, your iframes would be like negligible. So that made rolling really unreliable, especially if you're not being super precise with it. And that caused a lot of problems for a lot of people. Rolling just didn't feel safe the way that they were used to. And then, like, just in general animations, and this is not just like character movement, which I mentioned earlier, like the way that you move feels different, but also the animations for like attacking and all of these sorts of things, they also feel very different. I heard a lot of people describe them as floaty, but in general, I think that just it felt less snappy and responsive than Dark Souls 1. I would have to think about this a lot more, and I'm not an animator, so I can't say exactly, but I think that there's just a little bit too much adherence to sort of trying to be realistic with how movement felt, and it ended up resulting in the movements not feeling video gamey enough. And so I think that might have caused some of the problems, but that's my speculation. And then some of the healing stuff. So Estus was like much slower to both use, and it was a heal over time as opposed to kind of like an instant burst up. And then the whole additional healing items like life gems and the metals that you could crush to like cure poison and whatnot and heal. Like you had a lot of additional healing options, which is very different, and the ability to kind of move with them and all those sorts of things. So there's a number of very significant differences here with the way that combat in general felt, just on a individual, like, every player's going to experience this basis, and a lot of these were considered negatives in some way. They made the game feel less responsive is generally what was happening, or they made people feel that their options for defending themselves were nerfed and things like that felt really uncomfortable. And then the lore is another just big area, right? It was super disconnected. Drain Lake has almost nothing to do with Lordran. And that could have been okay if it was clearer what was going on, but frankly, like, if it was clear that, oh, this is, what became of Lordran, but there's none of that, right? And in many ways, it was a standalone game, right, in terms of the lore, with like most of the connections being kind of on the level of like Easter eggs, or like you look at the Moonlight Greatsword as an example of a weapon that shows up in a lot of From Software games, right? Or there could be things that, you have a similar longsword in Demon's Souls to Dark Souls 1. It's like, okay, broadsword or whatever. You have these parallels, or like Hiltless to the Chaos Blade. So you have a lot of these parallels, and a lot of things are on that same sort of level. There are some other like tenuous connections, but a lot of them feel pretty tacked on. Like, if you didn't have explicitly stated in the lore, it wouldn't really seem to be there. So there's a lot of that going on too. And so I think a lot of these failures to deliver disappointed a lot of people when it came to the game. And really, what this comes down to is the fact that it was named Dark Souls 2 for some of these. Obviously, some of the combat stuff is its own business, and I'll talk about a lot of that stuff in more detail in a future episode, but there's a lot of this sort of failure to capture what people envisioned a Dark Souls 2 would be. And this really was a disappointment to people that I think could have been avoided by not naming it Dark Souls 2. If people weren't anticipating that the game would be a lot closer to Dark Souls 1 because of the name than they did, I think that they would have been more accepting of a lot of these differences, some of the combat stuff aside. So it's really important to kind of reflect on what impact a name has. Like, if you look at some of the network test footage, just as an example of this, you see that the spell icons changed dramatically between there, where they had their own unique icons, to ones that felt much more like Dark Souls 1 icons when the sequel came out, and when Dark Souls 2 finally released. And I think things like that were changes to try to make it feel more like Dark Souls in general, like more like a Dark Souls game. But a lot of the things that make it Dark Souls, I'm doing air quotes that you can't, finger quotes that you can't see, are very superficial type things. And I think that ended up leaving things feeling very disconnected to people. So the first part of this retrospective, for me, is really understanding that the name Dark Souls 2 primes us to expect certain things, and when the game didn't deliver on what it was being primed to us, it left us disappointed. Not because what we got was bad, but because it wasn't what we were expecting. I kind of refer to this as the Poi effect, as it were, just because I had an experience on a family trip when I was young. My dad had a conference in Hawaii, and so the whole family went. It was a neat little vacation, but we were at a one of those sort of late night of evening events, and it was dark and it was outside, but Hawaii, so still warm. And we saw a substance, my sister and I, a substance that looked an awful lot like chocolate pudding in the buffet that was there. So we got it. And it was poi instead. And if you've ever had poi, well, I can assure you it does not taste like chocolate pudding. I don't know whether or not I'd like poi or not, but I certainly did not like what I got not being chocolate pudding. And you can have this effect too, like if you go to pick up a glass that you think is filled with, say, orange juice or milk or water, and it's one of those other substances, even though you might like the substance that's there, the fact that your brain was primed to receive one of the other ones means that it suddenly tastes disgusting, because milk does not taste like orange juice. And if your brain is expecting orange juice and you get milk, that's going to be really off-putting. And so I think that same sort of effect happened to an extent with Dark Souls 2, that people were coming in primed to expect more of Dark Souls 1, and they didn't get that at all. There was some mechanical connection there, for sure, just like there was a mechanical connection between Dark Souls 1 and Demon's Souls, but they were expecting more than that. And when they didn't get it, they were left scratching their heads and saying, well, I was expecting Dark Souls 1, what's this? I was expecting Dark Souls, where is it? And that's unfortunate, because I think that there's a lot cool about the game. And I'm going to get into some of those various aspects in future episodes. So until then, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.